Welcome back to another episode of Boots on the Ground, where we share insight into Israel's war, politics, and identity. I want to say thank you to our partners at the Jerusalem Media Group for helping make sure this happened, and thank you to our sponsors at Be There Israel for all those times you can't be in Israel, weddings, parties, funerals, for whatever it is. When you can't make it to Israel, Be There Israel has you covered. Shaun, how you doing?
I'm good, Ari. How are you?
I'm wonderful. It's great to be back in the studio again, another week.
Lots to discuss as always.
Right. Before we get into it, just remember, like, share, comment, tweet, Facebook, whatever you guys do, the more people that you share this with, the more we can do and the more episodes we can put out. All right, Shaun, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, I was looking at the news over the last few hours and I realized how quickly things change in Israel. So maybe it's a good time to go through what should have been the news highlights over the last week and explain how it's almost irrelevant and what is the big news story over the last couple of hours.
So if you'd asked me before we started recording, I would say the biggest thing that should be on the news was this imminent hostage deal that all of a sudden disappeared.
Absolutely. And if you go back over the last 10 days, absolutely. Netanyahu was in Washington. That was supposed to be the story, a hostage deal. What did it mean? Full deal, all the hostages, everything like that. Netanyahu comes back, and suddenly, what's the big news story over the beginning of the week is the Haredi draft, the ultra-Orthodox draft. That's supposed to be suddenly the big news story. Is it going to bring down the government? The different variations of the ultra-Orthodox draft. The fact that the army is going to now send out draft notices and there could be sanctions, arrests. There was even talk of canceling driver's license, all these different things, passports, all these different things to either force Haredim into the army or to force sanctions. And that was almost, if I can use the euphemism, putting a gun to the head both of Netanyahu and his ultra-Orthodox partners, because by law, some new deal had to be made. And that was the story of the last week.
Right. Up until a few hours ago.
Right. Well, even then, what happened after that is over the last couple of days, the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox parties, both Degel HaTorah and Yahadut, both agreed to leave the government. So that means Netanyahu's very stable majority of 68 is now down to 61. So now we have a whole new story of the imminent collapse of Netanyahu's government and the coalition.
Right. And then they all submitted resignation letters, which don't take effect for 48 hours. Those 48 hours end on Thursday, I believe.
Right.
In which case, Shas has already announced that if those resignation letters go into effect, that Shas is also going to leave the government.
Exactly. Which means
there'll be a minority government.
Right. And that all it means is that within any couple of weeks of the Knesset, the opposition can put forward a bill to dissolve the Knesset, and that's the end of it. We go to elections.
Well, that's an oversimplification, because all the Haredi parties have already publicly announced that they will not be voting with the opposition against the government. So the coalition would theoretically, as a minority, still survive. We've had minority governments before. And in the end of the day, in about another 10 days, we go to the summer break of the Knesset. So for 3 months, there's no legislation.
Right.
But there really hasn't been any legislation anyways, because since however many months ago, the Haredi parties haven't been voting with the coalition to begin with.
Right, absolutely. And
so
now
nothing changes.
Right, and there's actually another interesting aspect of all of this is Bezalel Smotrich's religious Zionist party. They've threatened the government and said, well, if Netanyahu makes any type of deal that ends the fighting with Hamas long term, they'll also resign. But Netanyahu, in his brilliant way, is also playing there for time, because like you said, all he needs to do is, despite everyone threatening to resign, and even if they do resign, if he can drag out all of this by another 2 weeks,
It's not even 2 weeks, it's 10 days.
Right. We go to the summer recess, and Netanyahu survives by default, regardless.
Until after Sukkot.
Exactly, because the government comes back around about the time of the Chagim, but nobody's going to do anything until after Sukkot, which means he's there until...
For another 90 days. And the 90 days, as we know in the Middle East, is a very, very long time.
And
And a
that,
lot could happen in 90 days. First of all, before we move on to what's happening now, in 90 days, there could be huge compromises made. Cooler heads can come in. They can have, now that there's no more threatening of anything because there's no legislative season, it's over the legislative season, which means they can't present, legislation to dissolve the Knesset. Like, there's no more threat hanging over everyone's heads. Everything becomes more stable. The whole country is on vacation. Schools are out. And all of a sudden, they might be able to actually talk and get somewhere with some sort of a negotiation, whether it means that they have a negotiated dissolution of the Knesset and we go to elections after Sukkot at an agreed upon time that makes sense, or they find some sort of an agreement to work out that drafts more Haredim, takes away some of the sanctions, leaves some of the money in play. They find some sort of a weird compromise that at least keeps the government together for another couple of months.
right, all of those are possibilities. And I want to go back to what you said before about how 90 days is a long time. Notice we've been speaking about all kinds of Knesset legislation, the Haredi draft. Initially, we were speaking about hostages. And we've almost forgotten we're still at war in Gaza. Just over the last week, 6 soldiers were killed in fighting. And we didn't even speak about that. And that, unfortunately, isn't even part of the discourse at the moment. What is actually going on with boots on the ground in Gaza?
Right. So I think that in Gaza, there's a lot of what I've been noticing also is that it's not just that there's not a lot of reporting on what's going on, it's very unclear. Like, even when I talk to friends of mine who are serving down there right now, it's very unclear what direction things are going in what aspect. We're back to fighting in Beit Hanun, which was when the war first started. I was one of the first soldiers into Beit Hanun at the very beginning of the war. We've been in and out of there 6-7 times. I'm not really sure what there is left to do there at this point. We're still fighting in Khan Yunis. Rafiah is flattened. It seems like the army is trying to do something and keep it as far out of the news as possible, which is a good thing. But at the same time, there's soldiers dying, which means we're actually fighting. But what progress is really being made?
Well, that was actually something I was going to ask you. As somebody who's been there in Gaza, in some of these hotspots, in some of these battles, why are we going back to the exact same places over and over again? Particularly the Beit Hanun area, and this is very important. Beit Hanun is the largest built-up area in northern Gaza, which is the closest area to Israel.
Right, it's right there.
The terrorists who committed the attacks on Sderot itself, who drove in on their motorbikes and their jeeps, came from Beit Hanun. And that was one of the first places that Israel went in and demolished and destroyed and really wiped out a lot of terrorists. But now we're back to fighting in Beit Hanun, losing soldiers, tunnel warfare. What's going on there, Ari?
First of all, the soldiers that were killed in a tank yesterday, that wasn't due to fighting. That, as far as I can tell from reports coming out, it was either a faulty ammunition that exploded inside the tank, or there was some sort of a technical fault that caused a horribly catastrophic and very, very horrible accident that killed 3 soldiers, and the commander of the tank was severely injured. But it's not by the enemy. It's a malfunction.
But I'm going back over the last week.
Exactly. But I think what happens at the beginning of the war, we very quickly advanced through certain areas, and we didn't clean them up completely. And then the army went back in multiple times to clean up more thoroughly in different sections that we had skipped over. In order to move very quickly forward, we took the critical positions, or the obvious ones that we could, and then we moved forward. And we left a lot behind, saying, okay, we'll clean up later. That was Herzl Levi's big plan of, we'll come in and out of different places, and every time we come back in, it'll be easier because we'll just continue where we left off. The problem is every time you leave somewhere, as we know, there's no such thing as a vacuum. Something else comes back. And as long as we've been supplying humanitarian aid into northern Gaza, into Gaza City, into Beit Hanun, which we should been saying that we shouldn't be doing because there's not supposed to be anybody there except for the terrorists. And the fact that we're still providing humanitarian aid means that there's a population there that shouldn't be there, which means there's terrorists there, and it's very hard to differentiate who's who. And they're still going through areas and cleaning them out, checking for finding more tunnels, destroying more tunnels, finding more war material, destroying more war material. It's just a constant, enormous amount. I mean, again, Gaza is a very small area, but it is so extraordinarily full of tunnels and terrorists and war material that no matter what you do, there's always going to be more to get rid of.
Okay, well, I appreciate that explanation. Now, based on everything we've been speaking about, like we said, we started off speaking about the hostage deal. We moved to the Haredi draft. We've now moved on to the fact that the government may collapse. Gaza's still going on. And that is not even the main story in our part of the world.
No.
And this is how quickly things move. Right now, the big story in Israel and in our region is, believe it or not, Syria. Syria, which in November of last year officially collapsed. The Assad regime was vanquished by the Syrian rebels, led by a man who is now called al-Julani. And he has been paraded around as the savior of Syria. He recently met with a whole lot of European leaders. There was even talk of Syria joining the Abraham Accords. And officially or unofficially, al-Julani met with a whole lot of Israeli officials to create some type of agreement and demilitarized zone in Syria on the Israeli border. So that's the way we're headed until what happened right now in the last few hours, and it's a developing story. Ari, what's going on in Syria?
So as far as I can tell from sources that I have available is that there's the area of Jabal Druze, like the mountain of the Druzim, and a city called Hudaydah. I'm definitely pronouncing Hudaydah. I'm definitely pronouncing it wrong. And the Druzim are sort of this ethnic minority that lives in southern Syria and northern Israel. They're officially loyal to whatever nation they're living under. They serve mainly in Israel. They serve in the army. I have a friend who's a Druze who was in the army with me from way back when. And the Druze of southern Syria have sort of quasi-allied with Israel. And Israel has basically provided a military umbrella that covers almost the entire region in which all of the Druzim live in southern Syria. And there's this like official yet unofficial relationship going on there. The Druze are still their own independent entity. And they made some sort of an agreement with al-Julani and his forces that the official al-Julani army, police, whatever you want to call them, can come into the Druze region to do sort of like a checkup just to understand who's where and what, basically more towards the like Druze militias. But the agreement was that al-Julani's forces would come unarmed and it would be a friendly visit.
Okay.
And instead, al-Julani's forces came with armored vehicles and tanks and guns. And of course, like all terrorists do, they just started killing people. So they started killing Druzim, and then the Druzim fought back. Israel got involved unofficially and quietly and provided air support for the Druzim and other support along the way. And now there's some uneasy ceasefire at the moment.
Okay, so there's a couple of things I want to go back and talk about. The first is you mentioned very briefly the Druze and what's called Jabal Druze, which is the Druze area, and Hudaydah. So if you don't mind, just so that everyone understands, I'm going to speak a little bit about who the Druze are.
That's a very good idea, Shaun.
Why they're significant, and what is the role they play in our part of the world. So Druze are a unique branch of Arabian culture and their own version. I'm not even going to call it Islam. They regard themselves as Druze, which are a separate religious and ethnic entity. And they've always existed pretty much for the last 1,000 years in the area of the highlands of Syria, Lebanon, and northern Israel. They exist as an entity unto themselves. They practice their own religion. They're a very secretive society with regards to what they do. They marry in themselves.
Very much so.
And they've always been seen by the various powers going back to the Ottomans as a very militant and self-protective group. Nobody really wanted to fight with them because they were very aggressive in protecting themselves. And because they always lived in the highland areas, they're also very strategically well protected. And they also served as a buffer zone for different areas. When the Ottoman Empire broke up at the end of World War I and the new countries and governments came along, the Druze found themselves separated by new national lines. Whereas before, there was the highlands in the areas where the Druze lived, but suddenly one group of Druze found themselves in Lebanon. Another group of Druze who could have been related to the Lebanese found themselves in Syria. And a whole different group of Druze suddenly found themselves in Israel. And then things got even more complicated, where Syrian Druze, after 1967, that were living in the Golan, suddenly now found themselves not under Syrian control, but under Israeli control. So it's a little complicated, but the idea being that they've always been aggressively or fiercely
protective
of their own. Over the last decades, it's never really led to bloodshed. It's more posturing because everyone agrees that the Druze are a unique minority. They are loyal to the country where they live, whether it's Lebanon or Israel, and there's no need to be aggressive towards them or to, if in any way, offend their culture.
Well, it's not only that. Their aggressive protectiveness doesn't come at the expense of everyone else.
Right.
In other words, the Druzim of northern Israel, they work, they support their own society. They're a very, very peaceful, very friendly group of people. They work in business across Israeli sectors from as far south as wherever you want to go to all the way up north. They're fully integrated into Israel with full citizenship. They serve in the army. They pay their taxes. They're protective in the sense that they're protective like an insular community, in the sense they marry within their own community. And you don't want to mess with them. You don't want to steal from them. But there's no reason to steal from them.
Right.
You don't want to attack them because there's no reason to attack them. They don't pose any threat to anyone. They're not expansionist. They're not looking to convert people. And there's the example of, was it 3 years ago, right before the war, when it was in Jenin, I think. It was in Jenin where you know the story I'm talking about.
Right. So the story was...
Was it Jenin?
It was Jenin.
Okay, so here, you tell it.
So the story was that a Druze was kidnapped by a criminal gang in Jenin. And the result being that his family took up arms and went to Jenin,
right,
and kidnapped back a number of Palestinians and threatened to kill them if their family member wasn't brought back.
Immediately. Like they gave a certain amount of time,
Yeah.
you bring him back, and that was it.
That was the end of the story.
And that was it. That was the end of it.
Right.
It was over. The hostage takers returned the Druze kid, they returned the other kids, and everyone went home, and that was it. But that's the extent of their aggressiveness. They're not going to go out of their way to inflict harm on anyone for no reason. They're not a criminal society. They're a very peaceful, very law-abiding, very honest group of people.
And also, it's important to point out that they serve in Israel's military from Sayeret Matkal, from the top units all the way through.
Everywhere.
Almost everyone who serves in a combat unit has served with and continues to serve with Druze soldiers because they serve alongside us with the best of us.
Exactly, because again, they're taught that if you do it right, you do it well, and you have an obligation. The same way we have an obligation, they have an obligation, and they live up to their obligations.
Right. So that's background to the Druze in general. Now, it's also important to point out that while there is a unique situation with the Druze in Israel, in Syria, it's a little bit more complicated for them in that under the Assad dictatorship, they were given a fair amount of autonomy. They looked after themselves. They weren't bothered by the Assad dictatorship, and they didn't take part in the civil war on either side. When various rebel factions began fighting against Assad in Syria, the Druze didn't get involved. They didn't get involved with with Assad, and they didn't take up arms as part of the rebellion. They stood on the sidelines. It wasn't a case of not seeing who would win. It wasn't their fight.
Right.
Now that there is a clear winner in Syria, al-Julani, who managed to unite the different rebel factions in Syria, they are now trying to consolidate power. That means, first and foremost, they went after Assad's loyalists, meaning the Alawite clan, anybody who was related to or in any way part of the clan or family units that were Assad, they're called Alawites, were targeted, in some cases violently
Very
wiped
violently.
out. Okay? And that was their way of consolidating power, specifically within the old guard of the military, and ensuring that the area around Damascus was clear of Assad loyalists. Now they've moved on to other pockets of areas they see as problematic, starting with the Druze.
Right. So I think that the point that we're trying to get at is that al-Julani is breaking what seems like a unspoken silent agreement of history, whereas you leave the Druze alone, they'll leave you alone. Where he's looking at is now he's demanding some level of loyalty from them or some sort of subservience, that they now put themselves under him, and he's breaking that autonomy that they've had, and he's demanding they now subserve themselves to him in a way that they're not willing to do. And he's trying to force it through violence, where he's going to come in and he's going to find that I'm stronger than you. And I think that's going to be one of his first critical mistakes, whereas you don't mess with the Druze.
Right. So that's important to say.
Especially when the Druze have the backing of Israel.
Right. So that's two important things that we need to talk about. Is firstly, there's, like you said, there's this unspoken historical agreement of leave the Druze alone.
Exactly.
And because Israel has a unique relationship to the Druze community, the Israeli Air Force got involved. The minute that al-Julani started bringing tanks and armored vehicles into the Syrian area and Syrian areas, the Israeli Air Force started attacking. Even though everyone thinks al-Julani is a bit of a saint, Israel was there to protect the Druze.
Well, is al-Julani really such a saint, or is he just the only one in the region that was able to put on a suit and tie, or not even a tie, just a suit jacket, and like play the part of I'm no longer a terrorist, I'm now a legitimate leader because I'm wearing a suit.
Right. And that brings me to the second point. Who is this al-Julani character? And I think it is fascinating because, again, it shows how quickly things change in this part of the world. Al-Julani, for me, even though I live in the area and I've been watching Middle East politics for years, I was shocked to discover who is this al-Julani guy who in November last year suddenly was the savior of Syria and was marching around as the head of the Free Syrian Army and vanquished Assad, and he was all over the news, accepted by European capitals, shaking hands. Who is this al-Julani character? Where did he come from?
Where?
So, interestingly enough, only a couple of months ago, less than a year ago, al-Julani was actually known as Muhammad al-Shah. And he was in hiding because for the last couple of years, he was the head of ISIS in Syria. But then he gave up being the head of ISIS, took on the mantle of the head of the Free Syrian Army, changed his persona to an al-Julani, and he was okay. But before he was the head of ISIS in Syria, he was still the same Muhammad al-Shah, and he'd actually undergone training in Baghdad, where he was a senior member of Al-Qaeda.
Okay, I see where this is going.
So we have an Al-Qaeda terrorist who joined ISIS, who has now reinvented himself as the savior of Syria. This is Julani.
Well, there you have it.
Right. So I'm going to bring it all the way back to our region. It reminds me of when you first learn about the Arab-Israel conflict, or more particularly the Palestinian issue. One of the first Palestinians, I'm going to use that term, you learn about is Yasser Arafat.
Right.
Yasser Arafat and the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, established in the 60s, was the quintessential Palestinian terrorist organization. They were bad people that carried out terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians. But then in the 70s, we were told, no. So the PLO is bad, Arafat is bad, but there's the splinter group called the PFLP, and they're a Marxist
Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
Right, PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation.
Popular Front
for the
Liberation of Palestine.
These are the real terrorists. These are the hijackers. They're Marxists. They're they're supported by the Soviet Union. These are the real bad guys.
Right.
But then in the 80s, we were told, no, 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 no. Now there's Hamas. Hamas, these are the suicide bombers. These are the really, really, really bad guys.
And then
you're told, no, well, okay, there's
Now
this splinter group. There's these crazy Islamic fanatics, Islamic Jihad. These are the
worst.
Those are the worst of the worst. And then we have Al-Qaeda and then ISIS and everything else. And my question is, so if we go back, the PLO, are they still bad? They still kill people. They still want us dead. Just because everyone else is so much worse doesn't mean the first people we spoke about are any good either.
It's not like they got better when everyone else got worse.
Right.
They stayed the same.
And just everyone else
and
got
everyone
worse.
else has got much worse.
Right. So they were killers. Everyone else is just bigger killers.
Exactly.
And I think it's the same thing now that very often in Middle East politics, we forget about that, is al-Julani has been accepted into Western areas and he's the savior of Syria. But nobody realizes that just a few months ago, when he was part of ISIS, he was a brutal killer. He didn't pay much attention to Western values and everything else. And before that, when he was part of Al-Qaeda, he certainly didn't.
Well, the question is, when the West looks at him, the question is if he can provide the stability to the region that's needed. Because in Syria, maybe the most brutal person is the person that should be the leader, because no one's going to challenge him. He'll provide stability. I don't think anyone's looking at Syria and thinking we're going to create a Western liberal democracy in that geographic region anytime in the next 2 or 3 generations. I think that's wishful thinking. The question is if he, as this brutal, horrible terrorist leader, could provide the stability that's needed for the region to stabilize and prevent and create less anarchy in it. And the question is if you're willing, we don't have to make a deal with him. You don't have to deal with him, but we can have some sort of agreement. You stay in your area, we'll stay in our area. The question is, what do we do about the middle ground? That's with the Druze. What do we do in the middle? And I think what we had assumed is he agrees to stay out, we'll stay out, and no one messes with the middle ground. We'll each stand either side of it, they're in the middle, and we leave them alone. But the second al-Julani got involved and said, I'm going to cross in and go to the Druze area, instead of us leaving the Druze to themselves, that brought us into the picture and got involved now. I think the reality we're looking at is we have to decide what we want to create in northern Israel, in southern Syria. What kind of reality do we want to create on the ground, and what kind of a people are we vis-a-vis our relationship with the Druze, and where should that relationship be? Because al-Julani, or Giuliani, whatever his name is, al-Julani, he's not changing. He's a known entity. We know what he is, what he's capable of, who he is. We know what the Syrian factions under him, who they are, what they're capable of. They're all different flavors of the same jihadi, Islamic insanity. The question is who are we, and what is that we want out of the situation?
Well, I would say that it's a little bit more than what we want out of the situation. Is what does the situation say about the region of the world we live in? Because remember, what's going on in Syria now is the result of a civil war and different factions. And even if the current Syrian leadership under Giuliani wants so we call it a détente, an understanding with Israel, and even if he himself he understands that he may have done things incorrectly with the Druze, he's still under his command are a whole lot of various factions, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and a variety of Islamic groups that don't necessarily agree with him. And many of them, yes, do want to take revenge on one another. And the Druze are seen as an easy target, even if he is not, even if he is nominally in charge. It's difficult for him to control all these different aspects. What does that mean for Israel? I think we need to be very careful. The Israeli government and Israel needs to be very careful. On the one hand, we need to look after the state of Israel and its citizens. That means we don't want to get overly involved in the internal politics of our neighbors. Because whenever we have, in most cases, it has not been very good.
No.
The most important case is Lebanon. We tried to, in the 1980s, Israel really tried to do the right thing and got involved in Lebanon, and it became a disaster. We were involved in internal politics, factional fighting, and mud for nearly 20 years, and that long term led to huge problems. In Syria, we need to avoid getting involved. However,
You
and
saw where I
here's the
was coming in
problem,
there with a question.
we have a duty to the vulnerable Druze community. And that is a very delicate balancing act.
Exactly. That's where I was going to go is that the Druze, while geographically they're a buffer between anyone in Syria and ourselves. And like you were saying, we have that moral responsibility to help protect them from their enemies who also happen to be our enemies. And I think destroying armored vehicles and tanks anywhere outside of Israel that one day could be used against us is never a bad thing.
I hear that.
Especially how much of a risk did Israel really take by destroying them? The airplanes weren't under any threat. I don't think there's any significant anti-aircraft ability left in the region. And we were able to provide protection for people that are unofficially allied with us. So that works out well. And the question is how we make sure that we continue to live up to those obligations without getting overly involved and now stuck in another war in Syria that we don't want to be in.
Well, I think that is where we're going to have to put a hold on things. We always like to end with something positive. So I'm going to go back to Moshe Dayan, a very controversial but highly regarded figure in Israeli politics. Moshe Dayan infamously once said that Israel can only be safe if it acts as the wild dog of the region, because nobody will want to start up with a wild dog. Unfortunately, that wasn't true. It didn't work out so well. But maybe we can be seen as the protectors of this region, the country that does the right thing. If Israel can be a country that is true to its own values, as Jews, as Zionists, and then we can extend ourselves personally, privately, and if need be, militarily, to ensure that good things are upheld in our region, I think that will lead us to better things in the future.
All right. That's a positive way to end it. I'm going to leave it there. So if you're still with us now, then you enjoyed the episode, you liked what you listened. So remember, share it with your friends, like it, and comment. And now, thank you from us here at Boots on the Ground and Jerusalem Media Group. Thank you to our sponsors at Be There Israel. For all those times you can't be here in Israel, Be There Israel has you covered. Thank you. We'll see you next time.